The day staying became automatic. She didn't remember the exact moment it started. There wasn't a fight or a door slammed or a sentence that changed everything. It was quieter than that, almost polite. It started with small decisions that didn't feel like decisions at all. Staying late, saying yes without checking her calendar, swallowing a sentence because the timing felt off, telling herself she'd bring it up later. Later became a familiar place she kept meaning to visit. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. The relationship still existed. The routine still held. People would have said she was lucky, steady, chosen, loved. And she agreed with them, at least out loud. She learned how to speak about her life in a way that didn't invite questions. She learned which details to smooth over, which ones to leave out. Not because she was hiding something dramatic, but because explaining it felt like too much work, and because she didn't know how to explain something that had no clear shape yet. She noticed how often she adjusted herself before anyone asked her to, how quickly she anticipated what would be easier for everyone else. She became very good at it. It almost felt like a skill. She could sense when a conversation would be inconvenient, so she shortened it. She could feel when her mood might disrupt the flow, so she softened it. She could tell when her needs would complicate things, so she edited them down until they fit neatly into the space available. At first, this felt like love. It looked like care. It sounded like maturity. She told herself this was what grown women did. They knew when to step back. They knew how to keep things running. They didn't make everything about themselves. She was proud of how little she asked for. It made her feel capable, reliable, easy to be with. There was a kind of relief in that. When you don't ask, you don't have to wait for an answer. When you don't name what you want, you don't have to face the possibility of hearing no. When you stay agreeable, things stay calm. Calm became the unspoken goal. Not joy, not closeness. Calm. She began to measure her days by how smoothly they passed. No tension meant success. No disruption meant she was doing it right. If something felt heavy, she assumed it was hers to manage quietly. If something went unspoken, she told herself it probably wasn't that important anyway. Important things, she believed, had a way of insisting on themselves. And if this hadn't insisted yet, maybe it didn't deserve space. But something was happening underneath that logic. Something subtle. She started to notice the way her body reacted before her mind caught up. The hesitation before opening her mouth. The pause before answering a simple question. The way she rehearsed explanations in her head that no one had asked for. She told herself she was just being considerate. But the truth was she was staying ahead of disappointment, managing it, preempting it. She became fluent in reasons. Reasons for why now wasn't the right time. Reasons for why this wasn't worth bringing up. Reasons for why she should just let it go. The reasons sounded responsible. They sounded kind. They sounded like someone who understood how relationships worked. And she believed them. She wanted to believe them. There was a moment she remembered later. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. They were sitting together talking about plans that didn't include her preferences, not out of cruelty, just out of habit. He spoke easily, assuming she'd adapt, and she nodded, already adjusting the shape of her week in her head. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the one she had learned to interpret as nothing. She smiled. She said, "That's fine." And it was in the way things can be fine when they cost you something small, but consistent. That was when she realized staying had become automatic. Not something she chose each day, but something that happened before she checked in with herself. Like muscle memory. Like reaching for a light switch in a room you've lived in for years. You don't think about it. Your body just knows where to go. She wondered when she had agreed to this version of herself. The one who was always available, always flexible, always willing to bend. She couldn't remember signing anything. There was no clear moment of consent. It felt more like a gradual narrowing, a series of tiny steps that made sense individually but added up to a life that felt smaller than it used to. She told herself she was being realistic, that this was how things worked once the early intensity faded, that wanting more was immature, that stability required sacrifice. She had heard these ideas her whole life. They were everywhere, in advice passed down quietly, in compliments disguised as expectations, in the way women were praised for endurance, for patience, for not needing too much. She wore that praise like a second skin. It protected her from being questioned. It protected her from being seen as difficult. It protected her from guilt, or at least it tried to, because guilt had a way of finding her anyway. Not guilt for staying, but guilt for even thinking about leaving. Guilt for noticing the imbalance. Guilt for imagining a different version of her life. Guilt for wanting something that didn't come with permission. She never said any of this out loud. Not because she was afraid of conflict exactly, but because once something is spoken, it becomes real. And she wasn't sure what she would do if it became real. It was easier to keep it contained, to let it exist as a quiet awareness rather than a fact that demanded response. So she stayed, not in a dramatic way, in a daily way, in the way you keep showing up to a job that no longer fits because leaving would be inconvenient, in the way you keep answering messages promptly even when you're tired, in the way you keep telling yourself tomorrow will feel different. People around her saw commitment, they saw loyalty, they saw a woman who knew how to make things work. They didn't see the calculations happening beneath the surface. They didn't see the way she was constantly weighing her presence, adjusting her tone, choosing silence over precision. They didn't see how often she left parts of herself out of the room. And she didn't correct them. Because being seen as good felt safer than being seen clearly. Being appreciated for what she provided felt easier than risking being misunderstood for who she was becoming. There was a version of her that remembered what it felt like to speak without pre-editing, to want something without apologizing for it, to trust that her presence didn't need to be justified. That version hadn't disappeared. It had just gone quiet. Not out of weakness, but out of adaptation. It learned when to step back. It learned when to wait. She told herself this was temporary, that once things settled, there would be space again, that once certain milestones passed, she could revisit what she needed. She built her life around that future moment, the one where it would finally make sense to take up more room. But the moment kept moving. The conditions were never quite right, and slowly, something shifted. She began to notice that staying didn't feel like devotion anymore. It felt like maintenance. It felt like holding something together with careful hands, afraid that if she loosened her grip even slightly, everything would fall apart. She wondered why it felt like her responsibility to keep things from breaking. She wondered when love had started to feel like vigilance. She didn't blame anyone. That was important to her. Blame felt messy. Blame felt unproductive. She told herself no one was doing anything wrong, and that was true in a way, but it didn't change the fact that something was off, that her life was being shaped by what she avoided rather than what she chose. There was a question she kept circling without touching directly. It showed up in quiet moments, in the shower, driving alone, lying awake at night while everything else was still. It wasn't a loud question. It didn't demand an answer. It just waited. If staying meant disappearing this slowly, what exactly was she being loyal to? She didn't answer it. Not yet. But the question stayed with her, changing the way she looked at her days. It made her notice patterns she had once called normal. It made her aware of how often she postponed herself. It made it harder to pretend that nothing was happening. This wasn't a turning point. There was no decision made by the end of the day. She didn't pack a bag or confront anyone or claim a new version of her life. She simply noticed, and noticing changed the texture of things. It introduced a quiet tension into moments that had once passed without friction. It made staying feel heavier, not because it was suddenly wrong, but because it was no longer invisible. She went on with her life. She made dinner. She answered messages. She showed up where she was expected, but something in her had shifted position. She was no longer fully inside the story she had been telling herself. She was standing just slightly to the side of it, watching it unfold. And that distance, small as it was, changed everything. Not enough to resolve it, not enough to fix it, but enough to make it impossible to go back to not seeing. And that was where this chapter ended. Not with a choice, but with awareness. Not with departure, but with the realization that staying was no longer neutral. It had a shape now, a cost, a presence she could feel in her body. She stayed, but she stayed differently. And that difference was quiet, unsettled, and unfinished. Being easy to live with, she had learned early that being easy was a form of currency. It made rooms quieter when she entered. It made conversations move faster. It made people relax. There was a particular satisfaction in watching tension dissolve because she adjusted herself just enough. She didn't think of it as disappearing. She thought of it as smoothing the edges, making things work. Being easy meant not asking twice. It meant noticing when someone was tired and deciding not to add to it. It meant keeping track of other people's moods and adjusting accordingly. She could sense a shift before it became obvious. A shortened reply, a distracted look, a change in tone that most people would miss. She filled in the gaps instinctively. She had done it so many times it felt natural, like breathing. People appreciated her for it. They said she was understanding, low maintenance, supportive. They trusted her because she didn't demand reassurance. She didn't create scenes. She didn't make things complicated. In a world where so many people were loud about what they wanted, her quiet competence stood out. She became someone others relied on without realizing how much that reliance cost her. She told herself, this was strength. And in many ways, it was. It took awareness to notice others so closely. It took discipline to hold back words that might disrupt the balance. It took endurance to keep showing up steady, even when she felt off-center. She was proud of her ability to manage herself, proud of how rarely she caused friction. But being easy had rules, unspoken ones. You didn't take up too much space. You didn't change your mind too often. You didn't let your needs interfere with the flow of things. You didn't become inconvenient. And she followed those rules so consistently that they started to feel like facts rather than choices. She noticed how quickly she dismissed her own preferences, where to eat, how to spend the evening, what mattered enough to discuss. She told herself these were small things, not worth the effort, but small things add up. They shape the texture of a life, and hers was becoming smoother on the surface, thinner underneath. There were moments when she felt the urge to speak and didn't. Not because she was unsure of what she wanted to say, but because she could already predict the response, the slight confusion, the pause, the adjustment others would have to make. She weighed that outcome against the effort it would require and decided it wasn't worth it. Silence became efficient. It saved time, it saved energy, it kept things easy. She began to notice how often she used the phrase, "It's fine." It covered a lot. It filled gaps where honesty would have required more space. It allowed her to move on without lingering. She said it so often that it lost its connection to how she actually felt. It became a reflex, a way of closing a door before anyone noticed it was open. Being easy also meant being predictable. People knew what to expect from her. They knew she would adjust, that she would understand, that she wouldn't make a big deal out of things. This predictability made her dependable, but it also made her invisible in certain ways. When you're predictable, people stop checking in. They assume you're fine because you always are. She didn't resent them for it. How could she? She had trained them well. She had shown them again and again that she would take care of herself quietly, that she didn't need much, that she would let them know if something was wrong. And since she never did, they believed her. There were times when she wondered what would happen if she stopped being so easy, if she paused before agreeing, if she said she needed time, if she asked for something without cushioning it. The thought made her uncomfortable, not because she feared rejection exactly, but because she feared the shift, the recalibration, the way relationships might have to reorganize themselves around a different version of her. She didn't want to be a problem. That mattered to her. She had seen how quickly women were labeled difficult, demanding, ungrateful. She had watched others pay the price for insisting on their needs. She had learned which behaviors were rewarded and which ones were quietly punished. Being easy kept her on the safe side of that line, and yet there was a cost to that safety. She felt it in the way she held her body always slightly braced, in the way she prepared explanations she never used, in the way she felt tired even on days that looked manageable from the outside. She didn't talk about that tiredness. She didn't have language for it that wouldn't sound like complaining. Sometimes, when she was alone, she let herself imagine a different posture, one where she didn't lean forward so much, one where she didn't scan the room before speaking, one where her presence didn't depend on how well she accommodated others. The image felt unfamiliar, almost indulgent. She quickly set it aside. She told herself relationships required compromise, that no one got everything they wanted, that this was normal. And it was. But she started to notice that the compromises always moved in one direction, that she was the one bending, adjusting, absorbing, that her partner rarely had to recalibrate around her because she had already done it for him. This wasn't something he demanded. It wasn't something he even noticed. It was simply the shape the relationship had taken, a shape she had helped create. That realization was uncomfortable. It challenged the idea that she was merely responding to circumstances. It suggested that her patterns had a role in sustaining what now felt limiting. She didn't know what to do with that awareness. It didn't point to a clear action. It didn't offer relief. It just sat there quietly, altering the way she interpreted her own behavior. It made her wonder how much of what she called love was actually habit. How much of what she called generosity was actually avoidance. Being easy had protected her from conflict, but it had also protected her from being fully known. People knew the version of her that fit neatly into their lives. They didn't know the parts she edited out before they could become inconvenient. She wasn't sure they would recognize her if she stopped smoothing herself down. There was a moment one evening when her partner asked her what she wanted to do, and she genuinely didn't know. Not because she lacked preferences, but because she had gotten used to checking his first. The question caught her off guard. She felt a brief panic, then named something quickly just to keep the moment moving. The ease returned, but the disruption lingered. She began to see how being easy had become a way of staying agreeable, staying connected, staying within the bounds of what was expected of her. It allowed her to remain in the relationship without confronting what it no longer gave her. It kept things functional even as they felt increasingly hollow. She wondered when ease had replaced closeness as the goal, when avoiding tension had become more important than sharing truth. She didn't remember choosing that shift. It felt like something that had happened gradually under the guise of maturity. There were other women like her. She saw them everywhere. In the way they apologized for taking up time, in the way they smiled through discomfort, in the way they said yes when their bodies were saying no. This wasn't unique to her. It was woven into the fabric of how women were taught to move through the world, to be accommodating, to be pleasant, to be easy. Knowing that didn't make it easier to step out of. If anything, it made it feel heavier. Stepping out would mean not just changing her own behavior, but disrupting an unspoken agreement. It would mean being seen differently. It would mean risking disapproval. Not dramatic disapproval, but the subtle kind. The kind that shows up as confusion, distance, or disappointment. She wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So she continued being easy. But now she noticed it. She noticed the split-second calculations, the way she minimized herself before anyone else could, the way she preemptively absorbed discomfort, the way she kept the peace by rearranging herself. This noticing didn't come with a plan. It didn't come with courage. It simply changed the texture of her days. What had once felt natural now felt intentional. What had once felt like kindness now felt like a strategy. She began to sense the difference between giving freely and giving to avoid friction. Being easy had been her way of belonging, of staying connected, of being chosen. Letting go of it even partially felt like stepping into unknown territory. She didn't know who she would be without that role. She didn't know how others would respond. She didn't know if the connection would survive without her constant adjustment. So she stayed where she was, but the ease was no longer effortless. It required attention. It required suppression. It required her to keep track of what she wasn't saying. And that effort, once invisible, began to show itself in small ways, in her patience thinning, in her enthusiasm fading, in her sense of herself becoming less distinct. She didn't say any of this. She continued to show up, to be kind, to be flexible. But underneath that, a question was forming. Not a loud one, not a confrontational one. Just a quiet wondering that followed her through her days. If being easy meant being less present in her own life, how long could she keep doing it without losing track of herself entirely? The question didn't demand an answer. It didn't push her toward action. It simply stayed with her, altering the meaning of her choices. It made being easy feel less like a virtue and more like a pattern, one that had once protected her but now asked more than she was sure she could keep giving. She went to sleep that night without resolving anything. She woke up the next morning and moved through her routine as usual. But something had shifted again subtly. She was no longer just staying. She was watching herself stay. And that distance, however slight, made the role she had been playing feel heavier than before. Not unbearable, not yet, but no longer weightless. What gets postponed? There was a list she never wrote down, but it lived somewhere behind her thoughts. Things she would get to later. Conversations she would have when the timing was better. Desires she would revisit once things felt more stable. It wasn't an official list. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in small deferrals that felt reasonable in the moment. She would think, not now. After this week, after things calm down, after he's less stressed, after we get through this phase. The phase always seemed to be something just about to end, and because it felt temporary, postponing herself felt responsible, patient, even generous. She didn't experience it as loss. Loss would have implied something being taken from her. This felt more like delay, as if her life was paused on a low volume while other things took precedence. She told herself she wasn't giving anything up. She was simply waiting for the right conditions. The right conditions became a moving target. She noticed it in the way her interests slowly thinned out. Things she once enjoyed now felt optional. She skipped them without much resistance. She told herself she was tired, that priorities change, that this was normal. She didn't mourn what she put aside because she assumed it would still be there when she returned. But time passed differently than she expected. Weeks folded into months, months into years, and the parts of her she had postponed didn't stay neatly intact. They dulled. They lost their urgency. They stopped knocking. Not because they weren't important, but because they learned they wouldn't be answered. She began to experience a strange quietness inside. Not peace, just absence, a lack of friction. A sense that nothing was particularly wrong, but nothing was especially alive either. She functioned well. She showed up. She fulfilled her roles. But she couldn't remember the last time she felt fully present in her own life. There were moments when something stirred, a comment from a friend about a choice she didn't make, a memory of who she used to be before everything became so managed, a fleeting sense of recognition when she saw another woman living differently. These moments passed quickly. She didn't dwell on them. Dwelling felt dangerous. It threatened the balance she had worked hard to maintain. Postponement had become her way of staying intact. If she never fully acknowledged what she wanted, she wouldn't have to grieve its absence. If she kept her desires vague, she could avoid the discomfort of realizing they weren't being met. Vague longing was easier to live with than clear dissatisfaction. She became skilled at shrinking moments of clarity. When a thought surfaced that pointed too directly at her own unhappiness, she redirected. She reminded herself of what she had, of what others lacked, of how things could be worse. Gratitude became another form of postponement. It helped her silence the part of her that kept noticing the gap between the life she was living and the one she had imagined for herself. She wasn't lying to herself, not exactly. She was just selecting which truths deserved attention. She gave airtime to the ones that reinforced staying. She minimized the ones that suggested change. This selection process became automatic, happening before she even realized a thought had been edited out. There were practical postponements too. She delayed asking for what she needed because it felt disruptive. She delayed expressing dissatisfaction because it might lead to a conversation she didn't feel equipped for. She delayed acknowledging the loneliness she felt even when she wasn't alone because naming it would complicate things. Loneliness was a word she avoided. It felt too dramatic for the situation she was in. She wasn't abandoned. She wasn't mistreated. She wasn't alone in the literal sense. Using that word felt like an exaggeration. So she replaced it with more acceptable language. She was just tired, just distracted, just going through a phase. She noticed how often she filled her time with tasks, productive things, useful things, things that justified her presence. If she stayed busy enough, she didn't have to sit with the emptiness that crept in during quieter moments. She didn't have to ask herself what she was postponing or why. Sometimes late at night, when the house was still, she would feel it more clearly. A sense of herself as a background figure in her own life. Someone who supported the story without driving it. Someone who was necessary but not central. The thought unsettled her, so she rarely stayed with it. She would distract herself, scroll, read, sleep. She told herself there would be a moment when everything aligned, when it would make sense to re-enter her own life more fully. She imagined a future version of herself who had the space, the energy, the permission to want more. That future self felt distant but reassuring. As long as she existed, postponement felt temporary. But occasionally a different thought surfaced, one she didn't like. What if the postponement was the point? What if the structure of her life required her to remain secondary? What if there was no later that made this easier? She pushed that thought away. It felt too heavy, too final. She preferred to believe in gradual shifts, in natural evolution, in the idea that things would change without her having to disrupt them. She remembered times earlier in her life when she had acted differently, when she had taken risks without knowing how they would land, when she had trusted her instincts more than the expectations around her. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a younger version, less responsible, less careful. She told herself she had grown up. That caution was a sign of maturity, that not everything needed to be chased. She framed her postponement as wisdom rather than fear. And in many ways, that framing made sense. It allowed her to move through her days without feeling like she was betraying herself. But the body remembers what the mind reframes. She felt it in the low-level tension she carried, in the way her shoulders never fully relaxed, in the way she sighed without realizing she was doing it. These were small signals, easy to ignore, but they accumulated. She noticed how often she said maybe later even to herself. She postponed rest, postponed joy, postponed confrontation, postponed decisions. It gave her the illusion of control. As long as nothing was decided, everything remained possible. She didn't have to face the reality of limits. Limits were something she avoided thinking about. She didn't want to accept that time was finite, that energy was finite, that staying in one version of her life meant not living another. She preferred to believe she could eventually have it all, just not all at once. Postponement kept that belief intact. She began to realize how much effort went into maintaining that illusion, how much mental space was occupied by keeping track of what she wasn't addressing. It was like holding a door shut with her foot while continuing to move forward. She could do it, but it required constant attention. There were moments when she caught herself envying women who seemed less careful, women who spoke plainly, who left relationships that no longer fit, who chose differently without providing elaborate justifications. She told herself they were braver, or more selfish, or simply built differently. She didn't see herself as someone who could move that way. It didn't align with who she believed herself to be. Her sense of being a good partner, a good woman, was tied to endurance, to patience, to not needing too much. She had internalized that model so deeply that imagining an alternative felt like a betrayal of her own values. Postponing herself wasn't just a habit, it was part of how she understood goodness. She began to see how this belief shaped her reactions. When she felt the urge to assert herself, she immediately questioned its legitimacy. Was this really necessary? Was she being unreasonable? Couldn't she just let it go? The answer was almost always yes. She could let it go. She had let so much go already. Letting things go became another skill she perfected. She was praised for it. People admired her calm, her flexibility, her lack of drama. They didn't see the accumulation of what had been released. They didn't see how little was left unguarded. There was a quiet grief in that, though she didn't call it grief. Grief implied loss. This felt more like a slow erosion, like watching something wear away over time without a single moment you could point to and say, that's when it happened. She wondered what would happen if she stopped postponing, if she allowed herself to fully acknowledge what she had been setting aside. The thought made her uneasy. Not because she didn't know what she wanted, but because she wasn't sure she could have it without disrupting everything else. And disruption felt dangerous, so she continued postponing. But now, like with being easy, she was aware of it. She noticed the pattern, the way her life kept bending around other priorities, the way her own desires were treated as negotiable. That awareness didn't free her, it complicated things. It made it harder to dismiss the emptiness as temporary. It made it harder to believe that waiting was neutral. It introduced a sense of time passing that she couldn't ignore. She began to feel the weight of years not just lived, but deferred. She didn't share these thoughts with anyone. They felt too personal, too unformed. She wasn't looking for advice. She wasn't looking for permission. She wasn't even looking for change. She just couldn't unsee what she had begun to notice. Postponement had once felt like a strategy. Now it felt like a state, a way of existing where her own life remained just slightly out of reach, always about to begin, always waiting for a signal that never came. She still stayed, she still adjusted, she still chose what was easier for everyone else. But something had shifted again. Staying no longer felt like a temporary compromise. It felt like a pattern with momentum, and that realization carried its own weight. She went through her days with a new kind of awareness, not urgency, not resolve, just a quiet tracking of what she continued to put off. Each time she deferred herself, she noticed it. Each time she told herself later, she felt the space between now and later stretch a little thinner. There was no breaking point yet, No dramatic moment where everything came into focus, just a growing sense that postponement was not a pause, but a direction. And she wasn't sure where that direction led. The chapter didn't end with action. It ended with accumulation, with the sense that something had been waiting long enough to be acknowledged, not resolved, not acted on, just seen for what it was. She lay awake one night thinking about nothing in particular, and realized she couldn't remember the last time she had made a choice that centered her without explanation. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with stillness, a quiet, unsettled stillness that stayed with her long after she fell asleep. And when she woke the next morning, the list she never wrote down was still there. Only now she could feel its weight. How staying is explained. She had become fluent in explanation, not the kind she offered to others, but the ones she repeated quietly to herself. They arrived automatically, lining up the moment doubt surfaced, each one ready to step in and restore order. They sounded reasonable, measured, adult. They carried the calm authority of things she had heard before and absorbed long ago. This is just how relationships settle. No one feels everything all the time. It's unrealistic to expect more. Things could be worse. He's a good person. She was careful with these explanations, choosing ones that didn't sound like excuses. Excuses implied wrongdoing. This was different. This was understanding. Perspective. She believed understanding was a virtue. When something didn't sit right, she reached for context. She explained his distance by naming his stress. She explained her disappointment by calling it temporary. She explained the lack of attention by reminding herself of everything else that worked. The explanations stacked neatly one on top of the other, forming a structure that made staying feel not just acceptable, but necessary. She noticed how quickly she stepped into this role whenever discomfort appeared. Before she could even fully register what was happening, she was already interpreting it in a way that softened the impact. It was a skill she had perfected over time, the ability to see all sides, to hold complexity, to avoid simple conclusions. People admired this about her. They told her she was fair, that she didn't jump to conclusions, that she saw the bigger picture. And she did. She saw it so clearly that her own experience often disappeared into the background. She didn't correct this. She took pride in being the one who could hold more. Explaining became a way of staying without confrontation, a way of remaining in place while convincing herself that nothing was being lost. If she could name enough reasons, she didn't have to name what hurt. If she could understand the situation fully, she didn't have to respond to it. She began to notice how one-sided this understanding was, how often she extended grace outward and how rarely she offered the same patience inward. When she felt restless or dissatisfied, she explained it away as personal weakness, as ingratitude, as something to be managed quietly. There was a particular explanation she returned to often, that love wasn't about feeling met, but about commitment. That real partnership required enduring phases that weren't fulfilling. She believed this deeply. It aligned with how she had been raised, with the examples she had seen, with the stories she had absorbed about what it meant to be loyal. But this belief had consequences. It meant that any discomfort could be reframed as proof of her dedication. The more she endured, the more committed she became. The less she asked for, the more mature she felt. Her ability to tolerate became evidence of her character. She rarely asked herself what she was tolerating. The question felt unnecessary. Tolerance had become the goal. It kept things intact. It kept her from making waves. It allowed her to remain the person she believed she was supposed to be. There were moments when the explanations felt thin, when she noticed the repetition, when she realized she had been using the same reasoning for years, even as the situation remained unchanged. These moments unsettled her. They suggested that explanation wasn't leading anywhere new. It was just keeping her in place. She responded to that unease by refining her explanations, making them more nuanced, more generous. She told herself she was choosing compassion over selfishness, that she was prioritizing stability, that she was being realistic about human limitations. She didn't question why realism always seemed to require her to accept less, why compassion always flowed outward, why stability depended on her flexibility rather than mutual adjustment. These questions hovered at the edge of her awareness, but she didn't invite them in. Explaining also protected her from guilt. Guilt was something she feared deeply. The idea of being responsible for someone else's pain felt unbearable. By framing her staying as thoughtful and considerate, she could avoid confronting the possibility that choosing differently might hurt someone. Explanation softened that possibility, turning it into something abstract rather than immediate. She told herself that leaving would be dramatic, that it would create unnecessary pain, that it would undo years of shared history. These explanations made staying feel like the kinder option. They allowed her to see herself as someone who prioritized others even when it cost her something. She rarely acknowledged that the cost was ongoing, that it wasn't a single sacrifice but a continuous one. Explaining made the cost feel diffuse, spread out, manageable. It kept her from having to face it all at once. There was a moment when a friend asked her gently if she was happy. The question caught her off guard, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wasn't sure which explanation to use. She paused longer than usual, then smiled and said something vague, something that sounded honest without being specific. The conversation moved on. Later, she replayed that moment in her head. She noticed how quickly she had defaulted to explanation rather than response, how she had chosen a safe answer instead of a real one. The realization stayed with her longer than she expected. She began to see explanation as a kind of containment, a way of keeping her experience within acceptable bounds. It allowed her to acknowledge dissatisfaction without letting it grow teeth, without letting it demand anything. There were times when she felt the urge to stop explaining, to simply say, "This doesn't work for me." The thought felt stark, incomplete, almost rude. It lacked the context she believed was required to justify such a statement. She couldn't imagine offering it without softening it, qualifying it, surrounding it with reasons. The idea of stating a need without explanation felt foreign. She had been taught that women who did that were difficult, ungrateful, self-centered. She didn't want to be seen that way. She didn't want to see herself that way. So she continued explaining. She refined her narratives. She kept things understandable. She kept things reasonable. She stayed within the story she had been telling herself for a long time, but something had shifted. Like with being easy, like with postponing. She was now aware of the role explanation played. She noticed how it stepped in to manage discomfort, how it prevented her from fully registering what she wanted, how it allowed her to remain in a situation that no longer felt reciprocal. This awareness didn't dismantle the explanations. It made them heavier, less seamless. She could feel the effort it took to maintain them, the constant internal dialogue, the way she had to revisit the same reasons over and over again. She began to wonder what would happen if she stopped explaining even internally, if she allowed herself to sit with the rawness of her experience without immediately smoothing it over. The idea made her uneasy. Explanation had been her anchor. Letting go of it felt like drifting. She wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. But the thought lingered. It showed up in moments of quiet, in the spaces between her explanations, in the pauses she filled less quickly than before. She realized that staying wasn't just a choice she had made once. It was something she renewed daily through the stories she told herself, through the meanings she assigned, through the explanations she repeated. And for the first time, she saw that those explanations weren't neutral. They shaped her reality. They defined what was possible. They kept certain questions at bay. One question in particular had become harder to ignore. Not a loud question, not an urgent one. Just a quiet presence that sat beside her explanations waiting. If she stopped explaining why she stayed, what would be left? She didn't answer it. She went on with her life. She continued to be thoughtful, to be fair, to be understanding. But the question changed the texture of her explanations. They no longer felt like truths. They felt like constructions, carefully built, carefully maintained. And once something is seen that way, it can't be unseen. The moment the pattern shows itself. It didn't arrive all at once. There was no revelation that split her life into before and after. What happened was quieter, almost inconvenient in how ordinary it felt. A series of moments that no longer fit neatly into the explanations she had been using. Moments that didn't escalate into conflict, but also didn't dissolve the way they used to. She noticed it first in repetition. The same conversation, different week. The same promise of later. The same soft disappointment she had learned to swallow without comment. What unsettled her wasn't the content of these moments, but their familiarity. The sense that she had been here before, that she knew exactly how this would go, because it always went the same way. There was a scene she replayed often afterward. Nothing dramatic. They were sitting together, distracted by separate screens, the room filled with the low hum of everyday life. She had mentioned something she wanted lightly, almost casually, not a demand. not even a request. More like an opening. He nodded, said something agreeable, and the conversation drifted elsewhere. She felt the familiar urge to explain it away. He's tired. It's not the right moment. It's not a big deal. But this time, the explanations didn't fully land. They hovered incomplete. She could feel the space where they usually settled and how it remained empty. She realized she had been mistaking continuity for progress. That time passing had felt like movement, even when nothing was changing. She had been waiting for a shift that required participation from both sides while continuing to do all the adjusting herself. The pattern didn't depend on intention. It didn't require malice. It only required her consistency. This wasn't a realization that made her angry. It didn't bring relief either. It brought clarity, the kind that's difficult to argue with because it's built from observation rather than judgment. She saw how often she softened her needs before they reached the surface, how she offered understanding before anyone asked for it, how she absorbed disappointment as part of the agreement she had never formally agreed to. The pattern wasn't just in the relationship. It was in her posture, in her tone, in the way she waited, in the way she framed her desires as optional. It showed up in how she asked questions she didn't want answers to because answering them honestly would require change. It showed up in how she measured her own legitimacy against how comfortable others remained. She began to notice the gap between what she felt and what she expressed, not in extreme moments, but in the small ones, the everyday ones, the ones that shape a life quietly. She saw how often she paused, recalculated, then chose the version of herself that caused the least disruption. This wasn't new behavior. What was new was her inability to unsee it. Once she noticed the pattern, it started showing up everywhere, in how she volunteered first, in how she waited last, in how she explained herself even when no explanation was required. It wasn't dramatic. It was consistent, and consistency gave it weight. She felt a subtle shift in how she occupied space. She became more aware of when she leaned forward, when she pulled back, when she held something in. She noticed how rarely she let herself fully arrive in a moment without checking how it would land. The awareness wasn't empowering. It was disorienting. It made familiar interactions feel slightly off balance. She had always believed that if something mattered enough, it would become clear. That clarity would force action. But what she was experiencing now didn't force anything. It simply accumulated. It made staying feel less like a default and more like a choice she was actively making over and over again. And that was uncomfortable, because it meant she could no longer frame herself as someone waiting for circumstances to change. She was participating, even if she didn't like the role she was playing, even if she didn't know how to step out of it. There was a moment when she almost said something, not because she had rehearsed it, but because the words rose naturally. A simple statement, direct, unadorned. She felt it in her body before she formed it fully. Then she stopped. The moment passed. The pattern resumed. But something remained from that near moment. A sense that the words were there, available, that she wasn't as disconnected from them as she had assumed. The barrier wasn't absence, it was permission. She began to question the idea that relationships drift into imbalance without anyone noticing. Someone always notices. They just don't always speak. She had noticed for a long time. She had just chosen to interpret her noticing as something to manage rather than something to respond to. This realization didn't come with blame. She wasn't angry at herself. She saw the logic in how she had arrived here, the rewards of being easy, the safety of postponement, the comfort of explanation. All of it had served a purpose. It had kept her connected. It had kept things intact. But it had also created a life where her presence was conditional, where her needs were negotiable, where her silence was mistaken for contentment. She saw how the pattern protected others from discomfort, how it allowed things to continue without recalibration, how it depended on her willingness to keep absorbing the friction. The pattern wasn't imposed on her. It was sustained by her participation. That thought lingered, not as an accusation, but as a fact. She began to sense a boundary she hadn't named before. Not a line she was ready to draw, but one she could now see. It existed between what she had been tolerating and what she could continue to live with. She didn't know where that boundary was exactly. She just knew it existed. This awareness didn't push her to act. It slowed her down. It made her more deliberate. It introduced pauses where there used to be reflexes. She found herself waiting a beat longer before agreeing, before explaining, before smoothing things over. These pauses were small, but they felt significant. She noticed how uncomfortable the pauses were, how quickly her mind rushed to fill them, how eager she was to restore ease. The pattern had trained her well. Disrupting it even internally felt risky, but the pauses remained. They created space she wasn't sure what to do with yet. She realized that staying had never been a single decision. It was a pattern of small accommodations that had added up over time. And patterns once seen carry a different weight. They ask different questions. She didn't answer those questions. She wasn't ready, but she no longer dismissed them. They followed her through her days, in the quiet moments, in the routine ones. They didn't demand resolution. They simply insisted on being acknowledged. The most unsettling part wasn't the pattern itself. It was recognizing how long she had lived inside it without naming it, how familiar it had felt, how reasonable, how invisible. Seeing it didn't free her, but it shifted her position. She was no longer just inside the pattern. She was looking at it, and that meant something had changed. Not enough to leave, not enough to speak, but enough to feel the tension between who she had been and who she was quietly becoming. The chapter ended there, not with action, but with recognition, with the sense that something had come into focus that could not be blurred again. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was personal, and it was present. The question, she doesn't ask. The question had been there for a while, not fully formed, not spoken, but present enough to shift the way she moved through her days. It followed her quietly, showing up in the pauses she now noticed, in the moments when she almost spoke and didn't, in the seconds after she said yes when something in her hesitated. She didn't ask it directly. She didn't sit down and confront it. She circled it the way you might circle something fragile on the floor, aware that stepping too close could break it. The question wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse. It didn't demand. It simply waited. She went about her life as usual. Work, errands, conversations that flowed easily because she kept them that way. But underneath the routine, something had shifted. Her attention had turned inward, not in a reflective way, but in a watchful one. She was observing herself as she moved through familiar roles, noticing the moments where she adjusted without thinking. The question surfaced most clearly when she was alone. In the car stopped at a red light, standing in the kitchen late at night, lying in bed while the house settled around her. It didn't arrive as a sentence. It arrived as a sensation, a tightening, a quiet insistence that something important was being avoided. She knew better than to rush it. She had spent years managing discomfort by explaining it away. She wasn't interested in doing that again. At the same time, she wasn't ready to disrupt anything. She existed in that in-between space where awareness had arrived, but action hadn't followed. The question brushed up against her sense of who she was: a good partner, a reasonable woman, someone who didn't make selfish choices, someone who valued loyalty. These were not abstract ideas to her. They were the foundation of how she understood herself. Challenging them felt destabilizing. She noticed how quickly she framed her own desires as potential harm. If she wanted more attention, someone else might feel accused. If she wanted space, someone else might feel abandoned. If she wanted to leave, someone else would be hurt. Her wants were always translated into consequences for others before she allowed herself to consider them fully. The question hovered in that translation process. It disrupted it. It asked her to pause before converting her experience into responsibility. It asked her to consider what was actually being requested of her and what she was volunteering on her own. She didn't like how unfamiliar this felt. For so long, she had equated care with anticipation, love with accommodation, stability with endurance. These equations had shaped her choices quietly, consistently. They had made her feel secure in her role. Questioning them felt like pulling on a thread that could unravel something she depended on. There were moments when she felt the urge to resolve the question quickly, to decide something, to reassure herself that everything was fine, or that change was inevitable, or that she would handle it eventually. Resolution was tempting. It would restore order. It would give her something solid to stand on. But the question resisted resolution. It wasn't asking for a plan. It wasn't asking for certainty. It was asking for honesty. And honesty, she was discovering, didn't always come with immediate clarity. She noticed how often she had used her capacity to endure as proof that she should. Just because she could tolerate something didn't mean it was sustainable. Just because she was capable didn't mean it was required. These realizations surfaced gently without drama, and that made them harder to dismiss. The question made her aware of how much effort went into maintaining the version of herself others expected. The mental calculations, the emotional buffering, the constant monitoring of the atmosphere around her. She had done this so seamlessly for so long that she hadn't recognized it as effort. Now she could feel it. She wondered what would happen if she stopped performing that role so precisely, if she allowed herself to be slightly less accommodating, slightly less available. The thought didn't fill her with excitement. It filled her with uncertainty. And uncertainty had always been something she avoided. She had built her life around predictability, around knowing what was expected of her and meeting those expectations reliably. The question introduced unpredictability. It suggested that her inner experience might matter as much as the external arrangement she had worked so hard to maintain. This wasn't a comforting idea. It challenged the quiet contract she had made with the world, the one where she offered stability and flexibility in exchange for belonging. The question hinted that the exchange might not be as balanced as she had assumed. She didn't share this with anyone. It felt too delicate, too easily misunderstood. She wasn't looking to be told what to do. She wasn't looking for validation. She was simply living with a question that refused to go away. Sometimes she caught herself imagining how her life would look if she answered it honestly. The image was unclear. It didn't present a clear outcome, just a sense of space, and space felt both inviting and dangerous. She had always associated space with distance, with loss, with things falling apart. She wasn't sure how to imagine it as something neutral, let alone something supportive. The question didn't try to convince her otherwise. It just stayed. It stayed when she agreed to things she didn't want to do. It stayed when she stayed quiet to keep the peace. It stayed when she felt that familiar pull to explain herself instead of simply stating what was true for her. It didn't interfere. It observed. She began to realize that the question wasn't asking her to leave or stay. It wasn't asking her to choose anyone over anyone else. It was asking her to notice the cost of not choosing herself at all. And that cost was no longer theoretical. She could feel it accumulating. The awareness didn't empower her. It humbled her. It showed her how deeply she had internalized certain expectations, how willingly she had shaped herself to fit them, how little room she had left for something different. There was grief in that realization, though she didn't name it. She felt a heaviness she couldn't attribute to a single event, a sense of something long carried without acknowledgement. The question held that weight without trying to lift it. She didn't know what she would do next. She didn't know if she would ever ask the question out loud. She didn't know if answering it would change anything. What she knew was that it had altered her relationship to herself. She was no longer fully aligned with the version of herself who stayed without question. She was no longer able to dismiss the discomfort as temporary or insignificant. The question had created a subtle distance between her and her old explanations. She continued living her life. She continued showing up. She continued being considerate and thoughtful and reliable. But there was now an undercurrent, a quiet refusal to fully disappear. The chapter ended without an answer, without a declaration, without a turning point anyone else could see. It ended with her holding the question, gently aware that asking it too quickly might flatten it into something manageable, something safe. She wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready to make it safe. So she let it remain what it was, unasked, unresolved, present. And that presence changed everything, even if nothing on the surface had changed yet. What remains? After nothing changes. Nothing changed on the outside. That was the strange part. The days continued in the same order. The routines held. The relationship remained intact, recognizable to anyone looking in. If someone asked how things were, she could still answer honestly in the way she had learned to. Fine, steady, the same. But something remained that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there and she just hadn't allowed herself to notice it. A quiet awareness that followed her through the unchanged landscape of her life, altering how each familiar moment landed. She noticed how often she was still expected to adapt, how naturally the weight fell on her side. Not because anyone demanded it, but because the structure assumed it. She had been part of building that structure. She could see that clearly now. Seeing it didn't dismantle it, but it changed how she stood inside it. There were moments when she almost reached for her old explanations and then didn't. Not because she had better ones, but because they no longer satisfied her. They felt thin, incomplete, like something she had outgrown without realizing it. She didn't replace them with new narratives. She let the silence sit. That silence was uncomfortable. It lacked the reassurance she was used to providing herself, but it also felt honest. It didn't rush to make sense of things. It didn't try to protect anyone from discomfort. It simply allowed the moment to be what it was. She noticed how often she had mistaken endurance for stability, how she had believed that as long as she could carry something, she should. That belief had shaped her choices quietly, persistently. It had made her reliable. It had also made her invisible in places that mattered. There was no dramatic collapse when she stopped reinforcing that belief internally. No immediate consequence, just a subtle shift in how she experienced her own presence. She felt less fused to the role she had been playing, less compelled to maintain it perfectly. She still stayed, but staying no longer felt automatic. Each moment of accommodation now passed through awareness. It wasn't enough to change her behavior, but it was enough to change her relationship to it. She could feel the effort involved. She could feel the cost. This awareness didn't harden her. It softened something. Not in a sentimental way, in a way that allowed her to be more precise about what she was giving and why. She began to sense the difference between offering something freely and offering it because she didn't see another option. There were moments when she chose the familiar path anyway. She didn't punish herself for it. She didn't turn her awareness into another standard she had to meet. She allowed herself to remain where she was without pretending it was neutral. She had spent so long believing that change required certainty, a clear justification, a plan. Now she saw that certainty often arrived after movement, not before. And movement didn't always look like action. Sometimes it looked like staying present with discomfort instead of immediately smoothing it over. She felt a new kind of fatigue, not the exhaustion of overgiving, but the tiredness that comes from holding truth without resolution. It wasn't pleasant, but it felt real. She trusted it more than the calm she had manufactured for years. She noticed how her body responded differently now, how it no longer rushed to close gaps, how it hesitated before agreement, how it registered moments of imbalance more clearly. These responses weren't loud. They didn't insist. They simply informed. She didn't share this shift with anyone. It didn't need witnesses. It wasn't something she could explain cleanly. It existed below language, shaping her experience without asking to be named. There were days when she wished she could go back to the ease of not noticing, to the comfort of believing that staying was unquestionably right. But that ease no longer felt available to her. Awareness, once present, couldn't be undone. She began to understand that her life didn't require a dramatic turning point to change direction. That direction could shift gradually through what she allowed herself to see, through what she stopped dismissing, through what she no longer rushed to explain. She realized that nothing changing on the outside didn't mean nothing was happening. Something was reordering quietly, not her circumstances, but her relationship to them. The center of gravity had moved slightly inward. She felt less driven to prove her goodness through endurance, less attached to being seen as easy, less invested in maintaining an image that required her to disappear. These changes didn't make her feel powerful. They made her feel grounded, present in a way she hadn't been for a long time. She still cared. She still considered others. That hadn't vanished. What had shifted was the assumption that care required self-erasure. She began to see that assumption for what it was. Not a universal truth, but a story she had been living inside. She didn't replace it with a new story yet. She let the space remain open. There were moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if she was imagining things, if she was overthinking a situation that didn't warrant this level of attention. She let those doubts exist too. She didn't need to resolve them immediately. She noticed that she was no longer rushing toward clarity. She was allowing herself to live with ambiguity, to exist in the not yet. This was unfamiliar territory. It lacked the comfort of roles and expectations, but it also lacked the suffocation she had grown used to. The relationship didn't end. It didn't dramatically improve either. It simply continued. And within that continuation, she was no longer fully the same person. She was present in a different way, less pliable, less automatic, more aware of where she ended and where others began. This wasn't liberation. It wasn't resolution. It was something quieter, a reclaiming of attention, a willingness to remain connected to herself even when it complicated things. She didn't know what this would lead to. She didn't need to. The need to know had loosened its grip. In its place was something steadier, a sense that she could trust her awareness to guide her even without a map. She had spent years orienting herself around what was required of her. Now slowly she was orienting herself around what was true for her, not as a declaration, not as a stance, as a practice. And that practice didn't announce itself. It showed up in pauses, in hesitations, in moments where she chose not to explain herself further. In the quiet confidence of allowing things to be unsettled, nothing changed, and yet everything felt different, staying with what is. She didn't leave, not yet. She didn't make a speech. She didn't draw a line or demand a shift. Her life to anyone watching looked much the same, and that was the point. What had changed wasn't the structure around her. It was the authority she felt inside it. She was no longer waiting for permission to notice her own experience. She wasn't asking someone else to confirm its validity. She allowed it to exist without translation, without justification, without apology. This didn't make her fearless. It made her honest. Honest about what staying cost. Honest about what she had been giving. Honest about what she could no longer pretend not to see. She understood now that choosing herself didn't always look like leaving. Sometimes it looked like staying present, staying aware, staying connected to the quiet truth that lived beneath her habits. She had spent so long being good that she had forgotten how to be real with herself. Not dramatic, not defiant, just real. There was a steadiness in that, a groundedness that didn't need to be explained. It didn't make promises about the future. It didn't require certainty. It simply anchored her where she was. She trusted that anchor, not because it told her what to do next, but because it kept her from disappearing. And for now, that was enough. She stayed. But she stayed awake, and that changed the shape of everything that might come next.